It all began on what seemed like an ordinary evening. Dinner was done, the dishes were stacked, and we had just transitioned from polite conversation to the usual household summit. Bills, chores, minor annoyances. It was our version of reality TV. But this time, the dialogue took an unexpected turn. I asked her about a bill that needed paying, a routine question, or so I thought. Her response, however, was anything but routine. With a sharp tone and a glare that could cut steel, she said, "I'm not your property." The words landed like a rogue Wi-Fi disconnection. Confusing, unexpected, and absolutely capable of ruining the evening. I froze mid-chew. Was this an accusation? A declaration of independence? A hidden audition for a soap opera? Her tone suggested she was drawing a line in the sand, and my instinct told me I was already standing on the wrong side. I nodded, pretending to understand, but inside, I was screaming, "What just happened?" As I cleared the table in silence, her words bounced around in my head like a rogue ping-pong ball. "I'm not your property." I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made over the years. Long hours at work, fixing things, solving problems, and ensuring her world ran smoother than a well-oiled machine. Was she suggesting I'd been doing all this to own her? That night, as she drifted off to sleep, blissfully unaware of the existential crisis brewing next to her, I stared at the ceiling, thinking, all right, fine. If she doesn't want to be my property, then she can handle things her way. The next morning, I executed Operation Independence with military precision. When she asked me to pay a bill, I smiled and said, "You can handle it." She blinked, confused. It was as if I had just declared cats could now legally vote. But she didn't argue. Throughout the day, I found other opportunities to let her embrace her newfound freedom. The kitchen faucet started leaking. I didn't touch my toolbox. Her car needed gas. It stayed in the driveway. Each time, her puzzled expression grew more pronounced, but she didn't say much. I, meanwhile, felt like a genius orchestrating the perfect social experiment. By the evening, a subtle tension had crept into the air. I could tell she was starting to notice that her life had gotten heavier. She hadn't put the pieces together yet, but I wasn't about to spell it out for her. If she wanted independence, she'd get it, complete with a 24/7 subscription to self-sufficiency. The next morning, I stayed in bed a little longer, enjoying the sounds of her struggling with the coffee maker. Normally, I'd be up brewing her favorite blend, but not today. Today, she was the captain of her own caffeinated destiny. When I walked into the kitchen, she was standing there, mug in hand, the car keys next to her. She shot me a look that said, "Well?" I took a sip of my coffee and scrolled through my phone like an unbothered Zen master. Finally, she broke the silence. "Aren't you going to take the car in for the oil change?" I raised an eyebrow. "You're not my property," I said, mimicking her tone from the other night. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd gone too far. But then she sighed, grabbed the keys, and muttered something under her breath about how she should have married someone less dramatic. As she walked out the door, I smiled. Was this the healthiest way to address our relationship issues? Probably not. But hey, if nothing else, it was entertaining. It started innocently enough. Over breakfast, she asked, "You're still taking the car in today, right?" I didn't even look up. "No, you can handle that." Her mug froze halfway to her lips. "What do you mean? You always take care of that." I shrugged. "Not this time. It's your car." Her eyes narrowed, and for a second, I thought the mug might become a projectile. But instead, she left with a huff, muttering something about new phases and slamming the door behind her. I sat there, sipping my coffee, feeling equal parts determined and terrified. The day continued with the precision of a sitcom plot. During her lunch break, she called me, "Hey, don't forget the car insurance is due tomorrow." I didn't miss a beat. "You can pay it. The account details are in the folder." Silence. Then a small, incredulous laugh. "Okay, what's going on with you?" "Nothing. Just letting you handle things," I said as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her pause spoke volumes, but she eventually sighed and said, "Fine, whatever." That evening, the tension in the house was thicker than leftover mashed potatoes. I had deliberately left the trash untouched and made dinner only for myself. A culinary masterpiece of microwave mac and cheese. She glanced at the overflowing bin. then at the sink where my dishes were stacked like an amateur Jenga tower, but didn't say a word. Finally, as we sat in awkward silence, she snapped, "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" I leaned back in my chair, feigning calm. "You said you're not my property, right?" Her jaw tightened. "Yeah, I said that." "Well," I said with a small shrug, "if you're not my property, then you're not my responsibility either." For a moment, I thought she'd launch into a lecture, but instead, she just turned on her heel and stormed out. I heard the bedroom door close with the kind of finality reserved for courtroom verdicts. The next morning, I stayed in bed a little longer, listening to her clatter around the kitchen. Normally, I'd have made her coffee, but today, I let her wrestle with the machine's stubborn buttons. She didn't say anything, but the coffee mug she handed me was definitely half-hearted. As the week went on, the cracks in our routine turned into canyons. The laundry basket overflowed, the pantry grew depressingly empty, and the utility bill. Well, let's just say I found out what life without Wi-Fi looks like. When the power cut out mid-afternoon, she came home in a storm of righteous fury. "The power's out," she yelled, throwing her bag onto the counter. "Why didn't you pay the bill?" I met her gaze with serene detachment. "You knew it was due. The account details are in the folder." Her hands shot up in exasperation. "Are you kidding me? You're being so childish." I stood, leveling her with a calm stare. "Childish? You said you're not my property. I'm respecting that. But independence comes with responsibility." For a moment, her anger faltered, replaced by something closer to confusion, or maybe realization. Then she let out a bitter laugh. "This isn't independence. It's you being petty." I didn't argue. Instead, I went into the kitchen, leaving her to stew in her frustration. Later, I heard her on the phone with customer service trying to sort out the utility bill. Her exasperated tone, as she wrestled with automated prompts, was almost enough to make me cave. Almost. By the end of the week, the house felt less like home and more like a sitcom set after the cameras stopped rolling. The mess was tangible, but the silence was worse. We were locked in a cold war of chores, each waiting for the other to break. And yet, as ridiculous as it all was, I couldn't help but feel that something important was happening. Whether we were dismantling or rebuilding, I wasn't sure. But one thing was certain. This new phase of ours would either be a lesson in compromise or the most absurd standoff in history. The shift in our home was subtle at first, a series of small, uneasy silences and unspoken questions. But I held firm. If this was the independence she wanted, I was determined to see it through, no matter where it led. By the end of that week, the tension in the house was unbearable. The power was back on, the trash had finally disappeared, and groceries had been restocked, not by me but by her. She was keeping things running, but barely. The weight of our unraveling routine was evident in the way her movements grew more abrupt, her sighs more frequent. That Saturday morning, I was at the kitchen table with coffee and my phone. She shuffled in, her hair still messy from sleep, and opened the fridge. The empty shelves greeted her, and she slammed the door shut. "This can't keep going," she said, her voice tight. I didn't look up. "What can't?" She turned to face me, arms crossed. "This, whatever this is, you acting like you're just a guest in this house. We're supposed to be a team." I put my phone down and leaned back in my chair. "Are we?" "Because the last time I checked, you said you're not my property. Teams rely on responsibility, and I don't think I'm part of yours anymore." Her jaw tightened. "Don't twist my words. I didn't mean for you to check out completely." "Well, the thing about words," I replied calmly, "is that they matter. You made it clear you don't want to feel like you owe me anything. Fine, but that goes both ways." Her frustration boiled over. "This isn't about owing anyone anything. It's about respect, not feeling like my life revolves around your decisions." I stood, the chair scraping the floor. "Respect? Do you think respect is me silently fixing every problem, paying every bill, cleaning every mess, all without a thank you? Do you think respect is telling me that all my effort makes you feel like your property? Because that's not respect. It's entitlement." She flinched, her arms dropping to her sides. For a moment, the fight drained out of her, but then she straightened, her voice quieter. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask you to do everything. No, I said, stepping closer. But you expected it. Every time I stepped in, you let me, and every time I tried to talk about how it felt, you dismissed it as control. Her eyes glistened, and she turned away, her fists clenching. So what now? Do we just keep tearing each other apart? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned back to the table and picked up my coffee. I don't know, I admitted, but I'm done being the only one carrying the weight. If you want independence, fine, but don't expect me to pick up the pieces when things fall apart. She stood there for a moment, as if waiting for me to retract my words. When I didn't, she let out a shaky breath and walked away, the bedroom door closing softly behind her. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating. The house, once a shared space, now felt like neutral ground in an ongoing standoff. Over the next few days, the cracks in our lives began to show. At work, I was distracted, replaying every conversation in my head. She too was struggling. I overheard her apologizing to her boss for a missed deadline, something she never did. One evening, I found her on the couch, her laptop open, hands buried in her hair. The Wi-Fi isn't working, she said flatly. I called, but the account's overdue. I hesitated, torn between stepping in and letting her handle it. You know how to pay it, right? She didn't respond. Instead, she closed the laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. Her words caught me off guard. What do you mean? This. She gestured vaguely at the room. All of it. I feel like I'm drowning, and you're just standing there watching. I wanted to argue, to remind her that this was what she'd asked for, but I couldn't. She didn't look defiant or strong. She looked exhausted. And in that moment, I realized something. This standoff wasn't working. We weren't proving anything. We were losing each other. I sat down across from her, my coffee forgotten. I didn't want it to get to this point, I said quietly. Neither did I, she replied, her voice breaking. The days that followed weren't magical. There was no grand reconciliation, no dramatic declarations. Instead, we reached an unspoken truce. The next morning, I found her at the kitchen table, sorting through bills and account statements. She looked up as I entered and gestured to the chair across from her. Can we do this together? She asked softly. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't defiance either. I sat down, and we started untangling the mess we'd let grow. Slowly, hesitantly, we began sharing the load again. Over time, conversations replaced silences. Real ones, where we said what we felt without fear of another fight. It wasn't easy, and there were still rough patches, but we were trying, not to fix what we'd lost, but to build something better. One night, as we sat down for dinner, she reached across the table and took my hand. I don't want to go back to how things were, she said, but I don't want to lose this either. I nodded, squeezing her hand. Me neither. And just like that, we began finding our way back. Not as property or responsibility, but as partners, learning to navigate the messiness of life together.